Welcome to another episode of the Bleeding Edge of Digital Health. We've got a tremendous guest today, Bill Hunter, CEO and co-founder of Canary Medical. Bill, how you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. No, I was pleased that you accepted, and couldn't be more excited about featuring what you guys have going on over at Canary. There's just a ton of relevant initiatives that you guys are pioneering in this digital space, and so really excited to have you come on and kind of dig into that. I guess before we get started with the company and the technologies, how did the health conference go for you? And then also wanted to highlight your inaugural conference that you guys had on the back end of health with AI. For those unaware out there, that's their new conference, Artificial Intelligence Applications and Innovations. How did those shows go for you guys?
They went really well. The AI, which we called active implants, artificial intelligence, was interesting for us. MedTech was a $500 billion industry last year in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So $1.5 billion worth of hardware goes in every single day, and very little of it is active or self-reporting or anything like that. And so there are active implants out there. You've got the CGM, you've got the stuff we're doing, you've got neurostim and stuff like that. But there wasn't really a conference on active implants and combining it with AI, which is where 98% of that's going. And it was a lot of fun. The shocking part of it is that virtually everybody we asked to come came. So we had a really great speaker lineup, and it was really nice. It was a ton of fun. I learned a lot. There's a lot of people doing some pretty cool work. Yeah,
that's a mouthful right there. Yeah, no, there's definitely some incredible things going on in this space. I heard a statistic that I've shared on this show a couple times. Of the medtech startup companies out there, 70% of the products have a digital component to them currently. Yeah. So I write a lot on LinkedIn, as do you. That's where I found you, and I find your writings to be incredibly on point, but also just you've got a really refreshing style. If you guys aren't following Bill out there on LinkedIn, I highly advise it. Really unique perspective, but also there's an authenticity to your writing that I've always appreciated. So I wanted to take time to mention that. Yeah, no, I mean, I've said on LinkedIn several times, is medtech cannibalizing digital health, or is digital health cannibalizing medtech? I don't know the answer to that question, but I know that there's a blurring of the lines significantly at this point, and it's going to be exciting to see how it all plays out. Why don't we just get started with having you kind of just give us for no other reason other than sheer curiosity's sake, I love to know how these companies get started. How did you guys get started? The name Canary, I'm guessing it has some reference to canary in the coal mine, which is a great analogy. But just tell us a little bit about how you guys got started.
So I'm a doc by training, and when I was just finishing up med school a very, very long time ago, I started a company called Angiotech, which made the drug-coated stents, made the Taxus stent and the paclitaxel balloons and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, they were OEM in the beginning mostly, right?
No, Boston Sci sold them. And I guess at one point we probably had 70% of the world stent market. It was crazy times.
Wow.
So in any event, the premise behind Angiotech, and there is a link to the Canary, I promise. The premise behind Angiotech was, medical devices fail because they get infected and inflamed, and pharmaceutical companies make anti-infectives and anti-inflammatories. Why did nobody ever put them together? So did that for 22 years, and we ended up being a pretty decent-sized company. And then that company ran its course, and with Canary, it was a very similar thing. I always say, old dog, same trick. You've got, my iWatch knows where it is on the planet. It tells where it is in 3 space. It can, do my heart rate and all kinds of other things. And it seemed absurd to me that all this medical hardware went in and none of it reported back. And it turned out that it wasn't really, much like Angiotech, it wasn't a technology problem. It's not like the drugs didn't exist, or it's not like the sensors didn't exist, or the power sources, transmission technology, it all existed. It's just that no one had really ever bothered to put it together. Just like drug companies didn't really collaborate with device companies, sensor companies and the likes, didn't work with classic hardware manufacturers. And so that was the premise of Canary. And as you alluded to, the canary in the coal mine was kind of the first biological sentinel. If the birds stopped singing, it was time to get out of the mine. And it was they were able to detect things that couldn't be seen and were otherwise unknown. And we thought, what if we pull data from inside the human body and particularly from sites of injury and sites of intervention, maybe we'll learn some really interesting things, and maybe we'll be able to provide docs with an early warning system. So that was a decade ago, but ever since then, that's what we've been working on.
Yeah, no, it's time goes by quick, huh? If you're in a startup to really innovate or create a new category, you got to have patience. You don't see those types of companies exit in 2 to 3 years. It's usually a long cycle. So patience is thy virtue, as they say. Why don't you? Can you give us maybe kind of just a high level overview of your current portfolio, which is the Canturio and the somatics, and then we'll get into Persona IQ here in a little bit.
Yeah, so my whole background's cardiovascular, so it's not like I was in this big hurry to get into orthopedics. But when we started building the devices, they were, they weren't that small, right? The batteries that we needed were, yay big, and we had antennas and the like, and so, we couldn't put these on coronary stents or, into small anatomical spaces. So, the total knee joint, hips and the like, they were large enough devices. Most of them had space that was, available, if you will, that we could, hollow out, and we could fill them with electronics without changing the function of the device. So
sure.
Our first efforts were in orthopedics. So we built a stem that went on to total knees. That's the Canturio product. Soon you'll see us do it in hips and shoulders as well. But the concept was to be able to embed the electronics into a total joint and have that total joint provide feedback. So the Canturio piece is the hardware, and the somatics piece is basically the supporting software. So not just the billing software that docs can use for monitoring their patients, but all the machine learning and all the analytics where we take that raw data and try and turn it into clinical insights.
Yep. No, absolutely. It's it's as I know you see and hear a lot on LinkedIn from some of these digital opinion leaders in the orthopedic space. They're pounding on the table. No more data. We only want insights. No more data. We only want insights. So to hear you say that you guys are turning that into actionable insights has got to be music to the orthopedist ears. So the Persona IQ is the first commercially available application for your technology in the marketplace. That was a joint venture-ish, I guess
Yes.
is the right word for it, with Zimmer. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we needed somebody's hardware to put our stuff into, and in total joints, Zimmer's the 800-pound gorilla. They're the market leader in knees, which is where we started, and Persona is their best-selling knee. So Persona IQ is the combination of our electronics package and the Persona knee. So it was, we couldn't have started in a better spot.
Yeah. Is that so? What went into picking Zimmer as your initial partner? Was obviously they're the 5,000-pound gorilla, right? They've got a huge market share, but it's when you're choosing partners within startups. I always say, you can have a great product, but if you pick the wrong partners, you pick the wrong software partners, you pick the wrong hardware partners, those can be crucial roadblocks to success, much further downrange. What was it about Zimmer? I mean, I know that they've made massive investments on the digital side of things in the last 2 to 3 years, but as you were projecting this out, what were some of the other things that were attractive as a partner?
Well, first, just what you said, just so it doesn't get lost in the discussion. I always say, when I sit on boards of companies or whatever, I always say that partnerships can make companies, but they can break them too. And
100%.
And I've been on both sides of it. I've had partnerships that, without Boston Scientific, drug-coated stent or stent would have had no possibility of being a reality. But, I've had other relationships that were very detrimental to the company. So you got to pick wisely. I'd like to tell you that this was some great strategic insight, but when we first started doing this, we got turned down by every orthopedic company in the world. And one of my co-founders, an orthopedic surgeon, who's designed implants before. One of my other co-founders spent 30 years at Zimmer on the commercial side, and between the two of them, they knew not just every major ortho company, but the secondary and tertiary players too, and everybody said no. And so we just kind of kept plugging on and building it. And initially we tried to build a design that would be somewhat universal that could be used, with different implants.
Sure.
And then one day, to your point, I don't think it was anything we said, but Zimmer, there was a management change within Zimmer, and a lot kind of cascaded from that. So initially we had done a deal that was really a toe in the water deal, where we said, hey, look, we'll go build this thing for you, and if you don't like it, you can throw it away, but if you do like it, we'll work together. And we started working with them on a kind of a quasi non-exclusive basis. And then there was a management change at Zimmer, and they bought the Rosa Robotics, they did the deal with Apple on iWatch, and all of a sudden Brian Hansen and his team were very digitally inclined. They were transforming the company, and I think somebody looked, in the back corner, and they were like, "Hey, we've got this digital implant too." And at that point in time, to their credit, they really embraced it, and they really upsized what we were doing, and they really gave us the opportunity to go again across the whole platform. But it was 7-8 years to an overnight success on that one, and it was really more that we were ultimately selected in the end. Other than not, some great insight and strategic vision by us, but very fun.
Yeah. Jeff Bezos said what happened at Amazon was 50% hard work, 50% good timing, and the rest was, as a result of amazing strategic decisions. And
yes,
timing is everything, right? You guys had the right product at the right time, and that is what it is. A lot of startups have.
They had a vision that they were going to do pre-op assessment with iWatch, and Rosa was going to give them intraoperative data, and then they're like, hey, if we have all this post-operative data, that could be really interesting. It could even potentially tell us how to put our implants in. It could inform Rosa as to, if different patients need different types of placement. And it could maybe ultimately even form our implants. So, do, obese inactive patients need a different type of implant than, slim, low BMI, highly active patients.
100%, yeah.
Aren't known, but if we collect the post-operative data, that's probably the best way to find out. So, they really had a broad vision for putting together this whole digital ecosystem, and we kind of slotted into that.
Just curious, and it's neither here nor there, but when you guys were kind of going through those iterations of trying to find a partner and really having a hard time getting an audience, did you ever consider designing your own implant?
We really, really did, and if we had, that's a much longer conversation. But
yeah,
if we had more funding, I think that might have been the way to go. Having said that, in retrospect, I think the right way to do this is the way we ended up doing it, because, the orthopedic implant business is it's a big business, but it also requires a really big sales force. It requires a really big commercial effort to be successful. We're probably better off being partnered with somebody who's already got that under control. But you're not wrong, though. As I look at our future products, I think if the sensing capability, if the measuring capability is truly the differentiating part of the product, and the product itself is not overly differentiated, so, kind of routine medical hardware, catheters, balloons, guide wires, even stents for that, in that regard. In that case, maybe the go-it-alone strategy makes a ton of sense. But in total joint orthopedics, I think the partnership strategy was ultimately likely the right way to go.
Yeah, that market's that's a beast to tame from a commercial perspective, and it requires an infrastructure that is really, it's not only relationships, but just the
trillion SKUs,
moving things around, and trays, and it's a lift. It's a heavy lift.
Yes, it is.
Well, now that's interesting. What so am I correct in my understanding that, prior to this coming out, the only option for acquiring this kinematic, 3D data was a really expensive post-op camera-based gait analysis which it wasn't utilized for all the reasons I just said very, very often. Is that correct? And if so, what's the barrier to what was the barrier to physicians having that analysis done? Was it more just because even if they got the data, they didn't know what to do with it?
Well, you're correct. So it was a Vicon camera system, and digitally integrated. Almost, if you picture it, almost like the video game type stuff. With the suit, and walking through the cameras and looking at all that stuff. So it was really only used, and is really mostly used, for really complex movement disorders, or things that are. It never was a routine follow-up for total joint. Now, having said that, kinematics, alignment, restoring normal movement is a very, very hot topic in orthopedics. So people were starting to look at this, but that wasn't necessarily a practical way to go about doing it. So, the first steps were things like intraoperative alignment and things like that, in robotics, to try and get, perfection with respect to placement. Then there was a movement with some things like wearables and various things post-operatively to try and get a more accurate view of kinematics. So this whole movement towards kinematic knees and the rest predates Canary by a long way. We just happen to have a tool that I think is going to be really effective for them.
Yeah. And so with that premise, then, what's the clinical problem? What's the use case that this was founded on? What's the and then I'll ask the second question afterwards, which is, what are the technical challenges that you're trying to solve? But clinical, what was the clinical problem?
That's a really good question, and it doesn't have a really straightforward answer.
For those, by the way, that I spoke earlier about your authenticity on LinkedIn, this is what I love about you, because you give a truly honest assessment, and that's rare these days. So I'm sorry to cut you off there, but that type of realness isn't too prevalent.
Well, I'm not an orthopedic surgeon, but I did practice medicine once upon a time, and the interesting thing is that 20% of knee patients are unhappy, which is not to say that 20% of knee replacement patients end up getting their replacement replaced. That's only 1, maybe 2% of people at most. And interestingly enough, there's been a lot of research over the last 25, 30 years looking at implant design and all kinds of different things. But that 20% dissatisfaction rate has been pretty consistent. It hasn't really moved, even with innovations in technology. So there's a bunch of suspected culprits. I think some people have loosening. I mean, a small percentage of people have things that have to be fixed: infections, loosening, soft tissue,
range of motion,
contracture, range of motion problems. Those are surgical type problems, but they're a relatively small percent. There's just this group of patients that are unhappy, and is that because it just feels unstable? Is that because it doesn't feel like my old knee used to feel? It's not anatomically the same way my knee used to work, or maybe my expectations were not set, or I don't have the same level of function. My function's good enough, but I thought my function was going to be a lot better than what I got.
Right.
And so that's really what we're hoping to figure out. Right now we're collecting daily data on everybody, and we're looking at we almost count every step you take for the first year, but we also do kinematics, many times a day. And, we're starting to look at what do the 80% of people who are really happy look like versus the 20% of people who are unhappy look like? Are there differences there? Can we tease those out? Is there something we can do clinically to help that? That is very much a work in progress. I think we're starting to see signs, but it's very much a work in progress.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of that too is won't be able to be derived until the data get smarter through AI and machine learning, and you get more data and you process all of that as the data set grows. So do the inferences, I would think. What would you say the technical challenges or the problems that this, because you have the clinical side with the patient, and then you've also got the technical side with the provider in procedure, pre-procedure even, really, because there's so much planning that goes into that. And this is I think it's part and parcel to robotics as well, right? Because robotics was created to create these technical advantages. And so what would you say that you guys are endeavoring there?
One of our surgeons put it in a really good, summed it up nicely, which is, he said, post-operative care is a bit of a black box, right? So you do all this planning, you do all this intraoperative planning, the surgeries now are incredibly precise and the like. And then you kind of walk the patient to the front door of the hospital and say, see you in 30 days, right? And if you follow that patient journey, more than 50% of people don't even come back for that 30-day visit. So you might not see the patient till 3 months, 6 months, whatever. So this whole recovery period, as we started doing these types of things, what is a normal step count on day 5? What is your range of motion on day 7? When do people start climbing stairs? A lot of this stuff just flat out wasn't known. There were bits and pieces in the literature from small studies or whatever, but a lot of what constituted normal recovery was just not known, and pretty difficult to tease out abnormal recovery if you don't really know what normal recovery looks like.
Yeah, you don't have a baseline.
Right. What's the old saying? You can't improve what you can't measure, right? So coming up with the measuring tools was a really important first step. So, fast forward to the payers and the others, the second part of your question, the providers all get that, right? The payers all get that. But, well, no buts. It's just they realize it's going to take a pretty substantive data set in order to make that happen, right? Some of the side effects in orthopedic surgery, let's take infection just because it's so catastrophic, is a 1.5% event. Your data scientists will tell you you're going to need to see 100 infections before you can build an algorithm around what an infection might look like from a data science perspective. Well, that's 10,000 patients, right? For that to happen in the wild. So you're not going to be able to just sit down, do 5-10 patients, do a small study and know where this is going to be. But the really, really fun part of what's going on right now is the data set is so complete, right? Because we get data every single day, because the patient really doesn't have to do anything at all. It's transmitted automatically. They don't have to remember to wear something or charge something or do anything like that. We're getting these really complete data sets. And so even small changes, small differences between different recovery pathways, we're starting to be able to find. And we can talk about this later in the podcast, but our first data science product came out on Monday, and we're starting to be able to tell, hey, are you in the 95th percentile? Are you killing it here in recovery, or are you lagging behind? And if you're lagging behind, is that something I need to worry about? So.
Do you guys have you guys looked at, or is there a modality to measure this data preoperatively, like what their baseline was, or for their for the leg which they're going to have the procedure on, and also for the other leg? It might be a little skewed because obviously there's compensation and whatnot, but how do you guys measure the baseline preoperatively?
So we're just phasing this in, but we've made a wearable version of our sensor array that soon, so docs can do a preoperative assessment when the patient comes in for their pre-op assessment.
That's great.
Have them wander around so that we can do an apples to apples, pre and post comparison of how things are going. One of the things that interests a lot of the orthopedic surgeons is that what we try and do in surgery is provide perfect kinematics. But maybe your kinematics aren't naturally perfect. Maybe your skeleton is, the way you grew up, you've got 3 degrees of varus or valgus, or 3 degrees of valgus. And if we give you perfect alignment, that might actually not be a good thing for you, right? So what we're trying to do is figure out if we can replicate, the gait as closely as possible going forward. What's fascinating is we now have a decent number of patients who have 2 smart knees in.
Oh, really?
So we're seeing, and sometimes they get them both at the same time, but a lot of times it's a staged procedure. And so we're starting to see how they walked, how they recovered, and then, get an idea of their gait when one of their knees is still not functioning, and then both knees are functioning. So we're seeing that whole, journey through different parts. It's there's some really fascinating data contained in those patients. So.
Yeah, I bet. One of the aspects of digital health and big data that's probably of most interest to me at this point is this data ownership and whatnot. How did you guys work through the challenges or the thought process around the HIPAA concerns and who's going to own this data and all of that? I know that was probably a big consideration for you guys before you were planning to bring this commercial.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's the way I was trained, and the fact that I'm not a lawyer. There's, I look at it as an ethical question, not as a legal question. The legal answer to the question in the United States is, I think last time I checked, only the state of New Hampshire says that the patient owns the data right now. Although California, New York, Illinois, many of the more populous states have legislation going through right now that will ultimately make it that the patient owns the data.
Yep.
Europe, of course, had taken that stance a few years prior. So we designed our system as if the patient owned the data. I think that is the philosophical answer I was most comfortable with.
Yeah.
In practice, right, in the real world, right, the doctor thinks the hospital thinks they own the data, the payer thinks they own the data, and you can't ignore that, right? Different people want access for different purposes, but I think the actual core data really should be the domain of the patient.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had Bertelmann Mesko, the medical futurist, on about a week ago, and I posed this question to him, and his answer was an interesting one. He said, I think the patient should figure out where they want it to go. Yeah. And it should be when you check into a hospital to and it could be via an app even. Yep. It's just we get. Anytime you sign up for an app through Apple, right? You say, do you submit to X, Y, and Z?
But you never read it. Yeah.
Nobody ever reads it. Exactly. But it could be as simple as during admissions. Just, hey, who are you okay sharing this with? And do you want it to be shared anonymously, or do you want it to be not be shared anonymously? Seems like such a simple solution to the problem, as we know in the real world. As you say, simple solutions don't survive typically, but yeah, that's it. That's interesting that you guys took that approach, and I think that's probably going to win out over the long term. Might be a little bit of brain damage in between now and then to get there, but I do think that ultimately the patient will get to control that, and maybe monetize it.
Absolutely, for sure, and I believe firmly that that's true too. And maybe we'll have time to talk about that as well. But, our first indication was really, really straightforward, right? Because it's an elective procedure. And so the patient comes in. This is something the patient wants to have done, right? And we have ample time to ask them whether they want a regular knee or a smart knee, and, where they're comfortable having data collected or not. The more complicated one is, as we're building things for aneurysm treatment or stuff like that, where
trauma.
the patient may come in and not be able to consent to any of it. That will be an entirely different story.
Yeah. No, and to your point, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Syneron and what they're doing in the brain-computer interface implant space. I mean, with all of this technology taking massive leaps forward, to your point, there's really no, you guys seemingly would only be limited by your ability to miniaturize, if that's a word, the technology. Yep. If you really extrapolate it out, ophthalmic applications, I mean, there's really no limit to what the computers can do as long as you can make them small enough to be able to put them in the organ that they're intended.
Well, this thing here it's a model.
I love it when people show stuff on this show. By the way,
it's a model that's 10x the actual size. And it's a millimeter cubed, and it's designed to go into brain aneurysms to tell whether they're leaking or not, so whether they're occluded or whether they're still bleeding, right? And so the answer is yes, you can get really small now.
Wow.
And, you may not be able to, one of the reasons our implant is, yay big is because we want it to last 20 years, right? So we need to have enough power to last 20 years. But if you're looking at an acute intervention where you might only need a week or two of monitoring, you don't need that much power.
Right.
Once you do that, you get down to some really, really small sizes. And so, back to the whole premise of what we were talking about, first question, it seems absurd that all these devices won't ultimately have some sort of feedback loop. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
There's very few devices you can think of that wouldn't benefit, as a clinician, you wouldn't benefit from knowing whether it was functioning normally or not.
Right.
And so that's ultimately going to happen. And I think it's fascinating you touched on the legal aspect. I would say right now, the single biggest barrier to moving this technology forward is a legal one, not a technology one.
Yeah. And that's not off. That's often the case, unfortunately. But and what of the tibial device that you guys have currently out on the market? What percentage of that is battery in terms of overall size?
More than half. The sensors themselves, you need a microscope to see, right?
Unbelievable.
The antennas are a decent size, although we figured out how to shrink them quite nicely as well. But most of it's about power. When we built all these devices empirically, right? We sat down with orthopedic surgeons and said, how long do you want to monitor? And they said 20 years because that was kind of the life expectancy of an implant.
18 to 23 years, I think, is kind of that standard.
They aim for 20, and that's what we did, right? Now, as I was saying, if you were building something else like a trauma nail or whatever, and you only only needed a few months of data, then you can really, really clamp down on the size. Because you just don't need that much longevity. So, that's just how we ended up in that space and in that size. Who knows? We might find out that people really only need to be monitored for a year or 2 years. I don't know. And if that was the case, then you barely even notice the implant.
Right. Yeah, but you start from the top with 20 years. If it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, especially in your first device, right?
Yep. And batteries are improving in efficiency every year.
Yeah.
And so things are getting smaller just from that perspective. Kinematic batteries are getting better and better. We don't use them right now because they're not approved by the FDA, but anyone who has a self-winding watch can tell you that you can use kinematic energy to generate power. There's certainly more than enough kinematic energy in a human knee to power it forever.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of getting the right one and doing the testing required to get it through the FDA.
Yeah.
We were using pacemaker batteries because they were already approved, and they already had a 30-40 year safety profile, right?
Yeah. Yeah, when you say kinematic, especially if you would think too, as blood vessels are beating, or triple A's, or there's movement, there's an inherent movement in that anatomy. So you would it would be interesting to see if it would be enough to drive the power needed to.
We had a researcher from Dartmouth at our conference who's working on that very aspect. Self-powered pacemaker leads, just using, the chamber movement of the heart to generate enough movement to power the leads.
Wow.
So, yep. Fascinating
technology. It's going to be really interesting 20 years down range to see, what all this leads to. In our healthcare environment is ever increasingly economically sensitive.
Yes.
What value could a payer or a provider extract from this type of, or what economic value can a payer or provider extract from this type of remote patient monitoring?
Yeah, that's
probably changing.
That is changing. I'll attack that question from two completely different angles. First, in just kind of classic, you and I read all the same things. So the classic story is, okay, we need, 51% of healthcare spending is institutionally based, right? It's based on the hospital and what it costs to hospitalize patients. So every patient you move from the hospital environment to the home environment, it's a substantive benefit. And every major healthcare system I can think of, is doing everything they can to do hospital at home, right? Earlier
For
discharge,
sure.
Do more management away from home. So, if back in the day, we'd keep our patients in for an extra couple of days if we didn't think that their home environment was great. If we thought they were just going to go home and lie on the couch, maybe you keep them in for an extra couple of days so that somebody gets them up, moves them around, make sure they're eating okay, make sure they're functioning okay. That's what we did.
Right.
Now if I could have somebody monitor that patient remotely, and see if they're moving around or not, or whether we need to send home care out, that's still going to be much cheaper than, having them in a facility, particularly one, that's a post-operative or step-down care, which is particularly expensive, right?
Right.
So, that's the classic story, right? The more things you can move out, the better. The more you can personalize, the better. The more you can tailor it so that we go from population-based medicine, where, let's face it, it means we're giving a lot of people treatments they don't need,
right,
or treatments that don't work, to finding treatments that work specific for the patient, they're tailored to the patient. That's the whole movement of what everybody is trying to do, right? On the other hand, in our little particular story, our little Canary story, what I'm starting to believe is that there's really two different types of monitoring after a major surgical intervention. There's a situation where your monitoring is part of the patient journey, so hips, knees, shoulders, that type of thing, where I'm trying to interact with the patient back and forth to get them a better outcome by tailoring, their physio, their activity, whatever it might be, in order to get a better outcome. That's a more complicated story because there's multiple steps, multiple payments involved. Sometimes there's multiple DRGs involved in doing that. And then there's a case where, it makes the device infinitely better, right? So if you knew your coronary stent was open or closed, that's a really valuable piece of clinical information. If you knew your aneurysm was leaking, that's a really valuable piece of clinical information. In that situation, in acute monitoring, it's really more the classic medtech model, which is it's a better solution for the problem. Better mousetrap, payments more upfront. It's not really about a data story. The first one, it's not really about the device because you're not enhancing the device at all, so it's really a data story. And in the second one, you're kind of enhancing the device, so it's all about the device and it's not really a data story.
Yeah.
So I think what's going to happen is you're going to see a blend of business models and you're going to see a blend of reimbursement models. And while it would be nice to say that it's, here's what you do with a monitored device, I think it's going to be different for each and every device pathway because the value that you bring is going to be very specific to the intervention.
Yeah. It's well, and you also have to look at going back to the technical advantages of products like this and robotics and whatnot. You start to look at like 90-day readmissions, all of that stuff. Factors into to the story. And every product has to have a clinical story and an economic story these days. Yes. And I think it's an evolving narrative, but I also think it's a relevant one. And I don't, I call them the Obamacare products, right? Like when Obamacare came down, it was, before it was like, when I started in this business back in '99, all of my mentors said, stay on the therapeutic side. Don't go into diagnostics. The therapeutics where the money is. Right. And then Obamacare came out and it became about, lower readmissions, personalized medicine, the length of stay, all of that became really came to the forefront, and these type of technologies are addressing that. The challenge I think hospitals are finding is, getting enough data to be able to measure that and to be able to really, and companies like you guys are doing you're really forging you're at the tip of the spear on this. It is really, making that available to them, doubling down and saying, here's why this is in your best interest, and it's the needle is not going to be moved overnight, but it's coming. I mean, it's not just coming.
You can't swamp them either, right? So we've got a crisis already of healthcare workers and burnout, and worse, we're probably looking at major shortages in healthcare workers over the next 10 years or so, and so reams and reams of data is not really the answer either. It's got to be integrated in the workflow, and it's got to be done in a way that isn't overly intrusive. I tell all my data scientists who are all went to schools I didn't get into, but they have these amazing things. They can do all these crazy things, and that's great. But it has to pass what I call like the X-ray test or the blood panel test, right? You have to be able to look at it, scan it for a few seconds, and know what's going on, right? If you got to go through 6 different screens and so it's never going to work. And so the story is going to be about the collection of the data, but it's also going to be about presenting the clinician with highly actionable things that they're able to follow, the way that you're trained to practice medicine, which is to go down a decision tree. And not just have reams and reams of diagnostic information. And I've seen examples of both. I've seen products that are great that kind of give you almost like a red light, green light phenomenon.
Yeah, it's binary.
Yeah, is which I think is really helpful. And I've seen others that just kind of spew out all kinds of stuff, and people roll their eyes because nobody wants to take the time to learn how to do it, and nobody's getting paid for learning how to do it either.
Right.
So there's a balance for there.
Have you guys, I haven't seen much in terms of, I know there's a lot of people out there working on smart implants and whatnot, but has there been any talk from any of the other major orthopedic companies about competitive products for Persona IQ, or are the other companies now hot on the trail now that you guys are seeing the success you're having, or what's the competitive landscape?
It's funny. I alluded to, when we got started, people were not particularly interested. But, I think what happened was, to be fair to the various companies, they looked at it and they said, this is really interesting. I can see how this is going to be. Like no one really argued with the basic premise of, I got to believe 10 years from now, devices are going to have to be self-reporting. Every other interaction in the world is connected to the internet. Right. $1 trillion industry is going to have to be too, period, full stop. Nobody really disagreed with that. They just questioned the slope of the line, right? So is this going to be a 5-year thing? It's going to be a 10 years, it's going to be a 20-year program. And I have people who said to me, Bill, that's great and everything, but I'm going to be retired by the time you guys do this. So when we went to AOS and we actually, were approved and we're starting to treat our first patients, people went, whoa. And when we planned, it was October 2021, right? So I would say since then, every major medical device company has a smart implant program now, right? Because that's not something you want to be behind on if other people are doing it, right? I mean, that has a high potential for significant differentiation. So like a lot of things in our business, it's kind of nothing, and then everything, Yeah. I lived through that in drug-coated stents. There's not a lot of interest, and then J&J and Boston Sci launched, and then every stent company had a drug-coated stent program, right?
Yep.
And I think you'll probably see this as well. I think you'll see, 3-4 years from now, you'll be able to fill your podcast with people coming out with smart implants.
Yep. So last question for you, because I want to be sensitive to time. What for Canary specifically, and you touched on this a little bit, as microelectronics become more miniaturized, more sophisticated, where do you see some of the kind of the next big endeavors for you guys? Is it AAA? Is it? And can you share anything more around that?
Yeah, like I said, I come from a vascular background. The implications in vascular are incredibly obvious, right?
Yeah.
If you have pressure and flow, everything else in the vascular system is mathematics, right? You have ejection fraction, systemic vascular resistance, stroke volume, right? Cardiac output, you can calculate all of it.
Sure.
And so, for the cardiologist or cardiac surgeon, that's like having an ICU inside your patient full time. And the implications in terms of, is my valve working or not working, are obvious, but that may even change what medications you give your patient to balance their hemodynamics. I mean,
sure.
It
makes too much sense.
It makes too much sense. And so orthopedics is fantastic. I've loved it. I think we're going to discover some really, really fascinating things. I think we're going to understand how human beings recover from, joint surgery, and we'll probably do something with a major spine company very, very soon, and so we'll get to see how people recover from back surgery. These are big medical questions, but in vascular, some of these interventions are going to be life-saving, life-supporting, life-sustaining, and I think that's a business that's just ripe for this type of technology.
I think doesn't Abbott's in that space a little bit with the
there's a few people starting to get into it. You'll see us in clinic in the not too distant future with a couple of different designs for a couple of different purposes. We kind of look at different pieces of physiology. Is the patient bleeding or clotted? That's pretty important.
Sure.
So that's something that we're working on. What's the pressure gradient across different devices? Which is really important in stenting. It's really important in valves. Pressure flow is everything in hemodynamics. So those are the things.
Heart failure, yeah.
Heart failure, valve replacement, coronary stenting, bypass, you name it, right?
Yep.
So it's and the technology's almost there. We're seeing sensor technology, not all of it invented for medicine, by the way. Some of it comes out of the oil and gas industry and stuff where pressure and flow really matter too, a couple of miles under the earth.
Yeah.
And so there's these really robust sensors. We're seeing tiny little ultrasound, all kinds of stuff, right? Yeah. And as that sensor technology comes along and it miniaturizes, and the power, which is really starting to catch up, I think that will be a really big change in cardiovascular medicine. Yeah.
Looking forward to seeing what you guys do for sure. That's my background. You touched on the coronary stent space, and I joined Medtronic right as J&J was launching right after J&J launched the Cypher stent, and then Boston Scientific had the Taxus stent, and we didn't have anything. And it was to your point, it was nothing, and then 100%. We you'd be lucky if a territory got a couple, just bare metal stents each month after those stents came out. It was just a rapid adoption.
Well, you know what? It reminds me a lot when I went around, peddling drug-coated stents to the major stent players. We had exactly the same response. I truly had somebody take me outside their building and say, "Do you see the word pharmaceutical anywhere here?" Right? I mean,
right.
No, we are not going to put drugs onto our devices. Right? That's a whole different regulatory pathway. It's a whole different. That's just not what we do here. But once it was reduced to practice, then it became the norm. And I think that's probably what you're going to see here as well.
Yeah. The other companies don't have an option but to get into the game. Mm-hmm. It's too many dollars at stake. Bill, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on. You guys have built a tremendous business, one that I find to be one of the most interesting and fascinating in our space. I've enjoyed following you, both, like I said, both on LinkedIn, but just following the company and what you guys are doing is sure to be as many great things coming out of that company moving forward as we've already seen, and really look forward to watching the trajectory of the company. But also at some point, maybe when some of these other advancements come out, we can get you to come back onto the show and do another recap. And definitely look forward to supporting the AI conference as moving forward. That's something that definitely want to be a part of in coming years. So thank you for doing that for the industry.
Thank you.
That's it, folks. We will be back with another episode after Thanksgiving, and appreciate you tuning in. Thank you again, Bill Hunter of Canary Medical, CEO and co-founder, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks a lot.